So let's jump into some questions real fast. We've got a whole bunch of great ones here.
Right.
And if you want to throw them into the chat, if you haven't had a chance, please do. Somebody asked a really interesting question about, is there evidence of warfare between the different groups? I wondered if you could expand that just a little bit and describe what evidence do we have of connections, trade, warfare, anything back and forth between the different groups in Texas during this kind of pre-Spanish period?
Yeah, there's lots of, that's another thing, that trade becomes a big deal amongst all these groups, particularly amongst the Caddos and the Humanos. The Caddos are producing food, but mainly they're producing pottery. Some of their pottery is some of the most advanced in the United States, and bows and arrows and things like that. And so this trade really starts to develop heavily. The Caddos are very closely tied to the Attakapan's, who are just downstream from on the Neches from them. So a lot of trade goes on there. And from the Attakapan's, a bit of trade goes to the Karankawas. The Karankawas live in such a weird place that they're sort of isolated. Not much trade with the Coahuiltecans. So the trade sort of is sort of east to west across Texas from the New Mexico area. So they're providing the produce of the buffalo and things like that in return for the finished goods that the Caddos make. Warfare is not really that prevalent. Of course, they do fight, and it's more for sport than it is for commercial gain or anything like that. The Indians, the men, they hunt and they form warrior clans, and for fun, they'll go attack other Indians. Always the Indians need people, so kidnapping, enslavement is always part of the deal. But none of this really becomes too intense and overly destructive until the arrival of the Europeans, and not really until the 18th century do we start to get real attacks for commercial purposes and enslavement going on.
Yeah.
At that point.
You talked about the fate of some of these different groups, and some people were wondering what happens to the Coahuiltecans. As you said, they're in such a, some of them, impoverished situation in the valley. Someone asked where they are, and they're definitely more associated with the modern valley of Texas,
Right.
geographically speaking. But what happens to them long term? The Spanish show up, they go into some of the missions around San Antonio, but then that doesn't really work out so much. And do we have a kind of broad sense of what happens to that particular group, or
I think they,
groups that make them up that?
For the most part, I think they become Hispanicized. The whole goal of the missions is to Hispanicize the Indians, make them good Catholics, make them adopt Spanish culture, admit them as citizens of the Spanish Empire and things like that. And the missions in Texas are the northernmost of those missions. They also have a series of missions south of the border and along the Rio Grande. So either the Coahuiltecans Hispanicize themselves and intermarry with Spaniards, and again, there's not many Spanish women there, so a lot of mestizaje happens, with mixed blood kind of thing, through it they get Hispanicized. Others die out. All these Indians are very susceptible to disease, so disease is the big destroyer of most of them. But I think the ones that survive ultimately end up being mestizos and Hispanicized along the Rio Grande Valley on both sides, actually.
Mm-hmm. This is a question I have. So what happens in 8,000 or 8,000 years ago that pushes them off the plains and into the rest of the geography of Texas?
Well, I think basically with the Ice Age coming to an end, and with the intensive hunting that the Indians have done up there on the high plains, they pretty much destroy that huge fauna that was up there. So remember, there's buffalo that are like 2 or 3 times the size of the buffalo that we know of. There's what else is out there? There's horses. It's like as Dan Flores puts it, it's the American Serengeti. All this huge animals are out there to be hunted, and that's what these Indians are doing. They're hunting them, and they hunt them so efficiently. And woolly mammoths, I forgot about those guys, and camels and all these kind of things. They hunt them so efficiently that in conjunction with the end of the Ice Age, which these guys are sort of cold, these animals are cold weather people groups, not people, this sort of brings them to extinction. Because of that, the high plains become sort of like what the high plains are now, not that great to be in if you don't have horses. So the Indians moved southwest, southeastward toward the rest of Texas in that period from about 10,000 to 6,000 BCE.
So not only geography matters, but the changing of the ice age and what happens as a result of that matters.
Exactly.
That dovetails one final question I wanted to ask. There's a lot of other questions in here, and hopefully some people can ask them during the document session, but I want to make sure we have time for that. I just want to ask, somebody asked, you know, what caused the Comanche, Elizabeth, I'm sorry, asked, what caused the Comanche to move downward into Texas? And what I always teach in my class was the arrival of horses from the Europeans that transforms that band of the Shoshones into horse culture that then moves down the plains following herds mostly of bison, and they end up in Texas and competing with the Apache. I wondered if you could talk very briefly about the transformation of the Apache from what I've always described as a very weak group walking around chasing buffalo on their feet, you know, to
Right.
a very different group and with the arrival of the horse, and like what that meant in terms of transforming the situation for a lot of these different groups.
Well, like you say, the Apaches do live out on the plains and they're hunting buffalo on foot, and that's a tough gig. So of course, when the Spaniards show up, New Mexico in 1600, they quickly take to the horse. First they eat it, but then they figure out it's better to ride than to eat. So they become the really first equestrian tribes here, and therefore this increases their buffalo hunting, but also increases their mobility. Thus, they can all travel throughout Texas. And one of the first things that they do, the Spaniards, they need laborers. And therefore, they sort of open up a slave trade to the Apaches. And the Apaches, using their horses and then the firearms they obtain from the Spaniards, they become a sort of slave raiders who now travel throughout Texas. And really, a lot of their hostility goes towards the Humanos south of them, those Pueblo-like groups.
Well, they
And
hunt the Humanos to death, essentially, raid them out of existence.
sort of, and yeah, exactly. And this ethnogenesis, the remaining Humanos probably join the Apaches and live with them, kind of thing, is how it works. Some go back to New Mexico's Pueblos. So the Apaches are the first, and the Comanches, I guess they're just a bit more numerous and a bit more warlike to begin with, because they get horses after the Apaches, but then they use them and are much fiercer than the Apaches were. So the Comanches will drive the Apaches toward the Lipon Apaches, the Texas variety,
Right.
towards San Antonio. And the Comanches are also drawn to Texas by the French goods coming from Louisiana. So that's another thing to remember.
So when we think about this period, we have all these different groups in Texas. But one of the things that happens is you have these early European explorers who come into Texas, and Cabeza de Vaca kind of just lands on the shore. But when you think of the Coronado expedition or the De Soto expedition, one of the things that comes with them, in addition to disease, are horses, right? Who are also coming up through Mexico. And that is something that is transforming a lot of these groups, even if Spaniards themselves haven't encountered some of these groups themselves, or, you know, in the 1540s or whenever this is all going on. So that there's a, you know, once the Europeans end up on the continent and then a couple traipse through this area, it starts transforming a lot of these groups in ways that will have consequences when the Spaniards show back up and try to build missions in the late 1600s in response to the French showing up.
Exactly. In that period from 1540 to 1700 or so, most of the Indians have got horses. La Salle gets to the Caddos and they have horses to sell him or give him. So, you know, these kind of things have already happened, and diseases have swept through as well. So basically disease and horses have affected the Texas Indians before the coming of the French and the Spaniards permanently, about 1700.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you. I know we have more questions, but hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about them in the document session. So.